Well, hello. Welcome back to the Embrace webinar series. My name is Claire Nicholson McClellan, and I have a passion for equipping the church to be disciples who make disciples. And I have had the privilege of curating and creating discipleship resources with Make and Deepen Disciples for 4 years. And I started my part-time role with Make and Deepen Disciples almost a year ago at the end of 2021. I am ordained with the Evangelical Covenant Church and have pastored in the Kansas City area the past decade. And I am married to Adam, who also received his Master's of Divinity from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. And our vision is to be a bridge between the community and the church. And we are disciple makers to our two young children, Theo and Grace. And this is webinar 27. Today we are talking with Amber Carroll, the creator of the course Christian Parenting in Sex-Obsessed Culture. And Amber is full of wisdom. I personally appreciate her in-depth understanding of sexual discipleship resources for kids ages 2 to 12. Amber spoke in to the curation of Embrace for Kids and Families, which is a new suite of age-appropriate resources to support children and their parents and caregivers in discipleship conversations related to body, gender, and sexuality. And today's webinar is the first webinar Embrace has hosted that's focused on sexual discipleship for young kids, which we'll explore together shortly. As a reminder, Embrace is a suite of human sexuality discipleship resources and experiences, which are curated and created by Make and Deepen Disciples of the Evangelical Covenant Church. And you can learn more at covchurch.org/embrace. And Embrace resources are in harmony with the adopted position of the Evangelical Covenant Church, the center of which is that the Christian standard is faithfulness in heterosexual marriage and celibacy in singleness. Our guest today, as I mentioned, is Amber Carroll, and she serves as the Director of Operations for Equip. And she is also the parent content specialist. And Equip is a ministry partner of Embrace, and it's dedicated to helping churches become places where Christians who identify as LGBT+ can belong and thrive according to a traditional sexual ethic. She has written extensively on how to lead younger kids in conversations about sex and sexuality in theologically accurate and compassionate ways. She lives in Nashville with her two young children, and Amber will tell you more about herself in her presentation. And so a few housekeeping notes. We're going to begin with an introduction to the full course, Christian Parenting and Sex-Obsessed Culture. And our goal is to leave enough time at the end for your questions. And so please type those in to the Q&A section at any time throughout the webinar. And then I will facilitate those questions, and we will do our best to get to as many as we can, as we want this webinar to serve you and your families and your churches. So welcome, Amber.
Thank you, Claire. I'm excited to get started. Let me share my screen. All right. We're ready. Before we start, I do want to note that I hold to what is sometimes called a traditional or a historic sexual ethic. It's just what Claire mentioned: faithfulness in heterosexual marriage and celibacy in singleness. So my teaching does reflect that view. And then I want to make a note that though the word parenting is large on the screen here, my teaching is generally directed to parents, but I think anyone who loves on or who disciples or who works with children in a Christian context can benefit from this particular webinar and from other teaching from Equip as well. As Claire said, my name is Amber Carroll. I am the Director of Operations for Equip here in Nashville. We are a team of missionary consultants. We equip local churches with the tools and strategy to transform their churches into places where people who experience same-sex attraction thrive according to God's teachings, and where all kids learn about God's good wisdom for sexual stewardship from an early age. Our executive director, his name is Peter Vaughn. He actually has presented on Embrace before. His was webinar number 15, and it was titled Becoming Churches Where Gay Christians Can Thrive in Celibacy and Mixed Orientation Marriage. So feel free to check that out later. I do have 2 young children. My daughter Blaze is 9, and my son Ransom is 7. And so a few years ago, I began to think about what does God say about sexuality and intimacy and family in the body of Christ, and how can I teach those things in age-appropriate ways to my very young children? The message I got from most of the resources that I found was keep your kids away from secular culture and teach them not to have sex until they get married, and they will be just fine. But I think that's not enough. God's designs for marriage and singleness, for intimacy and family, for sex and sexuality and sexual stewardship, all of that goes beyond just sexual abstinence before marriage. So I got to work researching, and that turned into writing, and that turned into a 6-week parent course that we titled Christian Parenting in Sex-Obsessed Culture. So the point of the course is to help parents, others who disciple kids, to gain a deep familiarity of God's wisdom for sexual stewardship for everyone, how to address and overcome fears, your own fears around these topics, how to address the lies of culture and the enemy, and over 35 scripts for conversation that are broken down into age groups so that parents, kids, pastors can get ready to start talking to young kids about these things. So our time together today is going to be a very brief preview of what you would find in the parent course. I do want to equip you with some solid resources. Again, 30, 40 minutes. Can't get to everything that's in that 6-week course. So I want to invite you to leave your email address with me. And if you do that, I'm going to send you a free resource guide that includes 10 different parent conversation starters. It includes lots of resources for parents and for kids and for churches. And it also includes the dates for my next parent course if you're interested in attending the full thing. You can use your smartphone to scan that QR code, or you can just go to equipyourcommunity.org/parent resource, type in your email address, and I will get that guide to you. And then hopefully you've checked the chat. You should have in the chat box a handout for this webinar. If you would like to look at that, it's got some space for notes if you want to print that out or just take notes on your device. But if you want to glance at that, I'm going to start at the top with the terms and the definitions to make sure that we're all just on the same page when I use certain words. All right, so let's look at some of those. You'll hear me say the word intimacy a lot, and what I mean by intimacy is close familiarity, friendship, close knowledge of. Sex and romance are forms of intimacy, but intimacy is broader than just those two things. So when I use the word intimacy today, I'm specifically referring to close, familiar relationships. And that can include, but is not limited to, a spouse. We all need close, intimate relationships, but we don't all need sex. And actually, marriage is not, or a spouse is not promised to us. And then family, I'm going to use that word a lot too. Family, I'm using this the way Jesus uses family. He says, my true mother and brother and sister are those who do what my Father in heaven wants. So I'm talking about a small group of Christians who live in close proximity, usually, who are intimately close in relationship and who embody the gospel for one another. Obviously, that can include a spouse, it can include your children, but it can also include chosen family, church family, and more. Everyone, regardless of their marital status, needs access to the love and belonging that families provide. And then I'm going to be talking a little bit about vocations. Here's what I mean by vocations. A Christian vocation is typically understood to be a specific calling with a specific design for a specific purpose with a specific provision. And so a relational vocation has to do with relationships. And what I mean is either Christian marriage or what we've called vocational singleness. And we'll define those in just a second. Both of those have specific designs, specific purposes, and specific provision from God to do them well. We're going to talk a tiny bit about discernment. This is the process of coming before God with a question. In our case today, it would be the question of relational vocation, seeking out his guidance, coming to a conclusion, and then moving forward into that calling. And then when I say sexual stewardship, God designed marriage and singleness and intimacy and family and sex and sexuality. He designed all of those with a way to steward them, with a way to manage them. So Christian sexual stewardship is much broader than what we do with our private parts, although obviously that is part of sexual stewardship. But maybe a better definition would be wisely managing our need and capacity for intimacy and family in God-honoring ways. So sometimes Christian parents, they ask me, why is this so important? Why can't I just have a couple of conversations about sex and marriage with my kids and call it good? Well, here's a few reasons why. One, because God expects us to teach our kids about his design for sexual stewardship. Ephesians 6:4 exhorts us to bring them up in the knowledge and discipline and instruction of the Lord. Proverbs 22:6 tells us to train up a child in the way that he should go. So this is not a job that God assigns to the kids ministers or the church's programming. It's a job he gives to parents, to caregivers who are in the home with their kids. Plus, research actually says that parents have a ton of influence on how kids think about these things. Teens ages 12 to 19 say that it's parents who have the most influence on their sexual decisions. And then this is also important because our kids are surrounded by stories. Our lives tell stories. The Bible tells us a story. Culture and the enemy tell us stories too. And if we're not being proactive, if we're not taking the time to tell our kids God's story about sexual stewardship, someone is telling our kids that story. Our silence doesn't mean that we're protecting our kids' innocence. Our silence means that our kids are learning the story of what sexual stewardship looks like from friends on the playground, or the latest kids movies, or pornography, or celebrities, or advertisements, or songs, or the enemy, or secular culture, or even cultural Christianity. None of which are going to teach our kids how to find true intimacy and family and thrive in their relationships. So I just mentioned culture. Let's look quickly at two cultures that most of our kids are going to probably spend some time in. That would be secular American culture and then also cultural Christianity. So both of these cultures, American or we could say Western culture and cultural Christianity, they offer incomplete and often ungodly narratives to our kids. They tell our kids maybe reality is whatever you feel like it is. Or maybe they set up rules for single people that are, special rules, or maybe they set up special rules for gay people, or maybe the culture focuses too much on romance. But in short, every culture is telling our kids a story about sexual stewardship. So what is the story that our kids are going to pick up from American or Western culture? One, they're going to learn that intimacy is romance and sex, and that these things are all for my own pleasure, that when I'm in a relationship, I remain faithful to that other person as long as they satisfy me. And when I fall out of love or I become dissatisfied, I just find a new person. American Western culture is going to teach our kids that sex is a need, but without any strings that would limit my freedom or my individuality or my true self. That romantic and sexual relationships are a right with whoever I want, whenever I want, however I want, that everyone deserves love. And by the word love, I mean a romantic or sexual relationship. And then if I deny myself a romantic or sexual relationship with the person that I desire, I am self-hating or I am repressive. Singleness is for myself. I avoid commitments in case something better comes along, and my money, my time, and my resources are mine to use for myself. And then family, there's very little commitment, long-term commitment, sacrificial commitment to any group or person. Family can be broken for another romantic relationship, for maybe differences like political differences or religious differences, or even taking a new job or something like that. And I think we would all agree that this is bad, that this is not what we want, the story we want our kids to learn. But what cultural Christianity teaches our kids is not great either. If you look on your handout, I give you a definition of cultural Christianity. But sexual stewardship in cultural Christianity looks like this. Intimacy is romance, marriage, and sex. I can remember my parents telling me, I'm praying for your future spouse. Well, why did they pray for my future spouse? Because within cultural Christianity, true intimacy is found in marriage and in sex. So to get the intimacy that we need, we must have sex, therefore sex is a need. And to get sex, we must get married first. Thus, everyone is expected to marry, and marriage is a right. And so because everyone is expected to marry, cultural Christianity typically focuses on urging teens to refrain from sex before marriage. And we actually use sex to still abstinence in cultural Christianity. If you'll just wait until you're married to have sex, it'll be incredible. Because the question is not if God will deliver that perfect someone to those who are faithful. The question is simply when. But by focusing only on marriage and sex, when we try to communicate a biblical sexual ethic to our kids, we admit that we believe intimacy and family are found only in marriage and sex, and that marriage and sex are the best things in life. And so for our kids who will never marry or never have sex for whatever reason, we mislead them into believing that their lives and their relationships are lesser. And for, and for our kids who will marry and have sex, we're setting up false expectations that marriage and sex will fulfill them completely and their spouse can meet all of their intimacy needs. And when we focus only on marriage and sex, when we talk to kids about sexual stewardship, the church suffers too. Very few people submit to the calling of singleness in order to serve God and his kingdom and the church with undivided attention. More Christians fall into pornography usage. Statistically, about 64% of Christian men and 10% of Christian women view pornography monthly. And then divorce rates soar when that fulfillment that we were promised doesn't come. Among people who attend church regularly, about 38% have been divorced. And then singleness. When we understand singleness as a time of waiting for our soulmate, of waiting for marriage, we treat our child's imagined future spouse as an idol, and we teach our kids to do the same. At best, singleness is a time of sexual purification that one must endure or suffer through. And at worst, celibate singleness is understood to be simply impossible. Because faithful Christian discipleship demands that the single person abstain from that which is ultimate, sex, singleness simply cannot be seen as a gift or a calling. It can only be a curse. And we often treat single people that way. We pity those who aren't married. We view single people as spiritually immature. We refuse to provide committed family to those who are called to the path of vocational singleness. And then family has very little meaning beyond parents, spouse, and children. Churches like to call their members a family, but often that's in word only. Nuclear families are usually the only option for family presented. And long-term sacrificial commitment is expected, but only to your spouse and your children. And so I think hopefully we can agree that, what cultural Christianity teaches our kids isn't great, and much of it isn't even biblical. So what are we supposed to do? Well, I think one of the best defenses we have against the lies of culture, any culture, and the enemy is to teach our kids God's wisdom. So I could spend the rest of our webinar giving you example after example of how to respond to your kids when they ask you a question about sex or sexuality. I could tell you how to talk to your kid about pornography or abuse. I could give you a long list of books and movies and TV shows you probably should not allow your child to have access to at a young age. And all of that would be helpful. But none of those things is actually going to give your kids a really solid understanding of God's good and weighty wisdom for their sexual stewardship. And that really should be our first focus, especially when our kids are young, ages 2 to 12. So how do we go about laying that foundation in our kids' lives? We have to tell our kids a better story. We have to offer them a better narrative. So the stories that the stories that American culture, Western culture, cultural Christianity tell our kids, they're not going to lead to thriving for our kids. It's God's story that leads to thriving. So God's better story has 3 parts. I'm going to outline them quickly, and then we will look at them more in depth. 1 is what God created us for. 2 is how things went wrong. And 3 is hope. So what did God create us for? Human intimacy in the context of lifelong lived-in family through either a Christian marriage or vocational singleness. And as our kids enter their young adult years, they will begin to discern with or ask God which vocation He wants to give to them. Part 2 is this: how things went wrong. Humanity's sin has bent and broken the goodness of everything that God created. We can see the results of that bending and that breaking everywhere. We're all broken in the area of sexuality. None of us can do intimacy or family perfectly. And because of that, we want to encourage our kids to share with us when they discover where broken sexuality is part of their story. Now that's the bad news. Here's the good. Part 3 is hope. We're still able to find beauty and goodness and flourish even in the broken world because God offers this wisdom through the Bible and the church. And when we follow God's wisdom, we'll find the greatest joy and deepest meaning and richest belonging in this life. And if we'll teach our kids those 3 things throughout their childhoods in age-appropriate ways, layering on depth and nuance as they age, they'll know what God's wisdom is for their sexual stewardship. So let's look at each part a little more in depth. So God created us with the capacity and need for intimacy found in family, both with Him and with other humans. Remember our definitions of intimacy and family from the beginning. God created us for those things. But where do we find that family? One of 2 places, either in a Christian marriage or through vocational singleness. What are those? Here's my definitions for those. Vocational singleness is a lifetime call to give up romance, dating, marriage, sex, and children to do kingdom work that parents often struggle to find the time, energy, or financial freedom to do. So they're using the time that they would have used to raise children to instead heal their communities and devote themselves fully to the kingdom of God in a way that's different from parents. And so Christian marriage then is a lifelong commitment between one Christian man and one Christian woman with, excuse me, with the goal of embodying the gospel both for each other and for the watching world, and then to be open to raising children. And while raising children is not the only kingdom work that Christian marriages will do, it is what makes Christian marriage unique. And it's the space that God has specifically designed for children to be raised up in the gospel, to know the gospel. So those called to Christian marriage may find or will find family with their spouse and with their children. And then those called to Christian marriage and vocational singleness may also find family with maybe their biological family, maybe chosen family, maybe their church family. It's not a call to exclusivity, and it's not a call to live without family. And both vocations preach the gospel by reflecting the love that's found in God's family. But how do our kids know which one of these things to choose? Well, one day our kids will get to ask God which vocation he wants them to seek out. God does have a preference for our relational vocation. He wants to communicate that to us, that the scriptures call these gifts. We don't get to pick out our own gifts. God does. God gives us that gift. And our kids don't discern these things until much later, right? Until maybe their young adult years. But we want to put forth the expectation that one day they will discern that this decision isn't theirs to make, and that neither marriage nor singleness is a right for them or is something that God owes them. So we want to remove assumptions. All right, and then part 2, how things went wrong. I'm going to tease out here what I mean by sin versus brokenness. So sin is a willful disobeying of God's law. Like if I intentionally, willfully, knowingly lie to you, I have sinned against you and I have sinned against God, right? But brokenness, this is what happened when sin entered the world through Adam and Eve. I love what the Jesus Storybook Bible says. God's creation started to unravel and come undone and go wrong. So God first perfectly designed and ordered the world. And then when humans sinned and then kept on sinning, that sin caused a chain reaction that bent every perfect design and order. Nothing, Romans tells us, was left unaffected by that bentness. And the world continues to be a broken place, and we continue to experience the effects of that brokenness because humanity continues to sin. So no one has unbroken sexuality. None of our kids do. We don't. And because of sin, we don't actually know what it's like to experience sexuality as God intended at creation. And because of sin and brokenness brought about by the fall, the way that we experience intimacy, family, singleness, marriage, sexuality, these are marred and dim versions of how God intended for them to be. So often parents, what we do is we focus on warning the teens in our care against committing sexual sin, that intentional, willful sin, right? And so we feel like we can wait to talk about sexual stewardship until our kids are teenagers, when they're likely to begin sinning sexually. But long before our kids are sinning sexually with intention, they're going to encounter the brokenness of the world and the sins of others, perhaps even others sinning against them. And so we need to start our conversations about sexual stewardship there. And it's not only about protecting our kids, although that's definitely part of it. It's also about helping them cope with the brokenness that they will encounter and experience themselves. Here's what I mean. We see sexual brokenness in infertility, in widowing, in intersex biology or physiology, in gender dysphoria, in same-sex attraction, in culture's idolatry of romance, and more. Your child could be sinned against, abuse, molestation, exposure to pornography, sexual jokes and slurs, and more. And then the sin of other people could affect your child, a divorce in the family, a parent or a sibling who is addicted to pornography, a parent who's had an affair, abuse in the family, and more. At creation, God did not intend for humans to experience any of those things that I just listed out. But even if none of the things on the previous 3 slides will affect your child, he or she will still not be able to do intimacy, family, singleness, marriage perfectly, or even well, maybe without the Spirit's help. Things like jealousy, selfishness, pride, bitterness, laziness, conceit, lust, and a host of other sins. These mess up the way that God intended for relationships and family to work. Again, we need the Spirit's help. We can't do this perfectly. So again, that's the bad news. Here's hope. We want to encourage our kids to share. When they discover brokenness, sexual brokenness, or whatever that is, you could say something like, these kinds of things are hard and scary to tell, but I hope that you will tell me the hard things as they happen in your life. I will listen to you and comfort you. You cannot get into trouble for telling me hard things, and I will be so happy that you've told me so that I can help. We'll figure it out together, and I will do whatever I can to help you thrive within God's good wisdom. And then when your kids do share, reassure them that experiencing broken sexuality is not their fault. It's a result of the fall, sin nature, living in a broken world, and a broken world that wounds us repeatedly. God's design for sexual stewardship does still apply. No matter what the category or kind or depth of brokenness that your child experiences, God still has a design for sexual stewardship, and it still applies to your child. God's expectations for us don't change based on brokenness. God has a really pretty high bar for the way that we are to steward our sexual selves. And that standard is the same for everyone. And then God is not surprised if your child or when your child experiences broken sexuality. And God is not disappointed in your child when they discover that brokenness. And then God is always at work to redeem all brokenness for our kids' good and for his glory. Our kids can still find beauty and goodness in this world because it is a world that was created by a perfect creator, by a good creator, and sin can't overcome that completely. And our kids are still able to flourish, even though they're burdened with brokennesses they didn't choose, because God shows us how through his word and through the church. All right, I don't have time today to delve deeply into the theology of Christian marriage or vocational singleness. I can't walk us through all of the passages of scripture that talk about family in the body of Christ. I wish I had time to teach you about all the characteristics found in God's family that our families are supposed to reflect, about the process of prayerful discernment. But when you're ready to take a deeper dive into these topics, it is all in the parent course. That's what the parent course is all about. And you can also read through some of the resources in that free resource guide that you can get with the QR code on the handout. I think it'll also be at the end of the slideshow as well. And then I know that Embrace has lots of webinars on these topics that will go more deeply into some of these topics as well. But what I want to do right now is look at some practical tips for teaching your kids this better story. So a question I get often from parents is when do I need to start talking to my kids about these things? And my answer is always earlier and more often than we think. Well, why early? Because of these statistics. One is puberty begins somewhere between the ages of 8 and 14. Kids become aware of sexual attractions around age 9 or 10. The average age of exposure to pornography is 11, although some studies are now saying it's closer to age 8. And about 14% of our kids will have sexual intercourse by age 15. So if we're looking at those statistics, it is wise to ensure that we have shared with our kids what we want them to know about God's wisdom for their sexual stewardship and God's love for people who experience same-sex attraction and people who experience gender incongruence no later than the end of 4th grade, and then follow up with more complex conversations throughout 5th and 6th grade. Quick side note, why do we need to talk about same-sex attraction and gender incongruence with young kids? Here's why. One, because your kids are going to know people who are LGBTQ+. And your kids need to understand that God's wisdom is good for people who experience same-sex attraction, for people who have who experience gender incongruence. And then 2, because your child could experience same-sex attraction or gender incongruence. Statistically, about 1 out of every 23 people experiences same-sex attraction or gender incongruence. Those are things a child does not choose to experience. They're brokennesses, they are a result of the fall. But if you're a kids pastor or if you attend a church with 23 or more children, odds are really, really high that at least one of them is going to experience an enduring pattern of same-sex attraction or an enduring pattern of gender incongruence. So teach your kids now that God's wisdom, expectations, and love is for everyone, regardless of who they're attracted to or how they feel in their body. And really, it's more important to ask who rather than when. Who do you want your child to seek out answers from? Who do you want to teach your kids about sexual stewardship? And if the answer is you, then you have to beat culture, right? And our kids are going to hear these things from the cultures that they are a part of very early. And so we have to make sure that we are equipping our kids before culture does. So the goal, again, is to guide our kids' understanding before culture is answering the questions that they're going to have. We want to be the approachable experts when it comes to questions of intimacy, family, marriage, singleness, sex, gender, sexuality. So now that we know when, I want to talk about some best practices. How do we go about talking to our kids about these things? I'm only going to mention a few. There are more on your handout and in the notes that you'll get later. Due to time, I'm picking out the top 3. One of them is don't make it a big deal. These are normal topics of conversation. Get comfortable with words like masturbation and penis and gay. And we talk about intimacy and family as much as we talk about obeying parents. And we treat conversations about sex and sexuality as normally as we treat homework. So no matter the question or the topic of conversation, we want to seek to avoid shaming our kids for being curious. If we discourage questions, we're going to have fewer natural opportunities to talk about God's wisdom. My kids are super comfortable with these things. They have embarrassed other adults by running up to me and saying something like, I think I have a bug bite on my penis, right? But that reminds me, okay, I might be doing an okay job normalizing these topics of conversation, and they know they're not ashamed to come to me to talk about these things. My kids have also said out loud in a crowd, is that person a boy or a girl? Right? So again, I know that they can come to me when they have questions, and that's a positive thing. You also want to have dozens of small conversations throughout childhood. That's why we say from age 2 to 12. These are bite-sized conversations. You don't need to put all of everything you want your kid to know about sexual stewardship in one conversation. Small bite-sized conversations. And because that keeps the pressure off of you, it keeps the pressure off of your kids, and it sends the message that these topics of conversation are important enough to bring up a lot, and they're a normal part of life. And then you want to continue adding depth to those conversations as your kids get older. When my kid was 7, we were at a playground, and an adult friend and I were talking, and she happened to run by when that adult friend said something, used the word gay. And my kid stopped and she said, "What's gay mean?" And I was caught off guard because she was playing on the playground and I didn't realize she was listening to our conversation, I just answered, oh, it's a boy who likes boys or a girl who likes girls. That's what gay means. And she said, oh, okay. And then she immediately ran away to play on the swings before I could continue the conversation with her at all. Now, is there more information that I want her to know about gay people or about the word gay or about, the theology of marriage or sexual stewardship? Yes, absolutely. But in that moment, I did not feel the need to over-explain or try to give her a bunch of theological information, because I know that that is not the only conversation that we're going to have about same-sex attraction. Multiple bite-sized conversations. And then you always want to give age-appropriate, honest answers. Give the information that is needed. Don't lie. Again, you want to set yourself up as the approachable expert. So if we lie about something like where babies come from and they figure out that we've lied, are they going to trust us with the harder questions about sexual stewardship? But keep it age appropriate. So for example, if your 5-year-old is learning the 10 Commandments and says, what's adultery? That did happen to me. You can talk about how God is faithful and how God expects us to be faithful to the vows that we make and to treat other people with honor and respect. But if your 12-year-old asks the same question, then we're going to want to make the conversation more age appropriate to a 12-year-old. Maybe we talk about abstaining from sexual sin. Maybe we bring up Matthew 5, where Jesus says that adultery isn't always a physical act. So our answers are going to be different based on the age of the child. And maybe the most important one is to avoid making assumptions. When we begin to talk to our kids about sexual stewardship, we often make 2 assumptions. One, we assume that our kids are going to be exclusively attracted to people of the opposite sex and that one day they will get married. Now, statistically, those things are both true, but the problem is they often color the way that we talk about marriage and singleness, or sex and sexuality, or family and intimacy. And when they color the way that we talk about those things, we're alienating our kids who will one day experience same-sex attraction, and we're unintentionally putting marriage in a place of honor over singleness. So one way we can make a change is just small changes to our vocabulary. So instead of saying when you get married, we can say if God calls you to a Christian marriage, or as you discern your relational vocation with God. And instead of saying something like, son, one day you'll find some girl pretty, we could say, son, one day you'll find someone attractive. And that kind of language speaks to all of our kids and lets them know that we are a safe person to tell if one day they do experience same-sex attraction. And it also takes the pressure off of them to conform to the kind of the church norm in some places that is marriage. It lets them know that vocational singleness is an option, a good option. Now, obviously, marriage is a good option too, right? There's nothing wrong with being married. God uses Christian marriage to bless our churches and our world. They are the primary places that children are raised up in the gospel, but there's lots of reasons your child may not marry. Maybe God has called them to vocational singleness. Maybe they are pursuing a career that's best suited for a single person. Maybe there's a circumstance or experience in your child's past or present that would make marriage very difficult, if not impossible. Or maybe God has called your child into a Christian marriage, but because of the brokenness of the world, no suitable spouse is available. Statistically, for every 100 Christian women, there are about 60 to 90 Christian men available in that same demographic, singles. There are literally not enough single Christian men to go around. And so we want to affirm singleness too, so that the kids who end up single, for whatever reason, can be assured that they are not a disappointment to us as parents, and they're not leading a lesser life because they lack a spouse. So here's how you can do it. Pray out loud in the presence of your child, not for a spouse, not for their future marriage, but pray that they would submit every part of their lives to King Jesus, whatever he calls them into. And when we pray that kind of prayer, our kids are going to know that we will not be disappointed if they never marry or if they one day experience same-sex attraction. All right. You've got some tips and tricks up your sleeve. I'm going to stop here and see if we've got some Q&A that's come in. And if not, we can go into conversation modeling, but I have a feeling we have some questions.
Well, thank you, Amber, for how you have framed things with culture and story, as well as just the theological depth that you've given and practical tips. So I know I'm walking away with some new things that I want to keep in mind in these ongoing discipleship conversations about sexual stewardship. And there are a few questions that have come in. And so Amber and I talked, and if we don't have time to get to the conversation modeling on different topics, it is in your handout. And we will be sending a follow-up email to everyone that has registered with the handout filled in. So if you missed a blank, no need to worry. We'll get you the information that you're needing. So let me see here the questions. One, which you just addressed, but just want to acknowledge this question, is what about unintended singleness? And so you just spoke to that there can be many different reasons for that. Anything else you want to say in terms of vocation, or, for those who don't want to be single?
Yeah, for sure. I think it takes a lot of, because of the way both secular culture and cultural Christianity kind of are, it is super hard to not be married, right? Our church programming, the way that our culture works, it's all set up for married couples or romantically involved couples and families. And when you don't have a spouse and or children, it's awkward and it's hard, and you can feel very lonely because our culture and often our churches expect us to get our intimacy needs met through our spouse. We're not great at intimate friendships. So it can be super hard. I acknowledge that. I am single. It is hard some days, even though I know that this is exactly where God wants me to be. I have no plans to be married. It can still be difficult when you don't kind of have a spouse in places where most other people do. But two, we need to, I think in our churches, because the expectation right now is marriage, we need to let go of that expectation, and we need to teach our kids God knows you best, and God knows what gift is best for you. And you might think that it's marriage, but if God is calling you to singleness, that's actually the better gift for you. And encourage our kids to ask God to spend, and it's not going to be 2 prayers and 1 talk with a pastor when they're 18 and then they know. It's going to be probably years of discernment and thinking about, we go into discernment in the parent course, but you can also read up on discernment, but just that process of prayerful discernment. And then if our kids are discerning and they're not getting an answer, they're not feeling a particular pull in either direction, we just continue supporting them as they continue to discern. There are going to be a small percentage of people that God calls to leave open the question. They don't commit to a marriage, but they also don't commit to a call to vocational singleness. That may happen. And then, like I said in the webinar, there may be people that God has called to marriage, but the world is broken. We are broken people. And for women, especially, there literally aren't enough Christian men to go around, single Christian men. And so we may spend our 20s, 30s, 40s or longer waiting for that spouse if we know we're called to vocational marriage, Christian marriage, or we may not ever get married. And we can lament that with our kids and lament that to God, but that could be a reality for some of our kids as well.
Thank you for that answer. And if there's any other questions, please send those in. We want to keep this to an hour, and we want to prioritize your questions. And there was another one that I saw, and we'll get to as many as we can. And I'm going to read it to you, and you can respond to it, Amber. This is more of a comment than a question, but I appreciate your thoughts. In your definitions of vocational singleness and marriage, it seems that Sacrifice is only required in singleness because of the emphasis in your definition on what single people give up, romance, dating, etc. But sacrifice is required in marriage too. Would it be more helpful to emphasize the sacrifices required by both singles and married people in these definitions?
Yeah, it's a great comment. Again, it's in the parent course. I just didn't have time to pull everything
Yeah.
in. But yeah, absolutely. We talk about how I think we have this kind of this idolatry of romance, even in the church sometimes, where we think getting married is we'll have sex every day and it's going to be great, and that our spouse is going to fulfill all of our intimacy needs, and there are no sacrifices. But y'all, if you're married, you know there are a lot of sacrifices in marriage, and married people are called to give up sex, dating, and romance with anyone else besides their spouse. They're also called to potentially give up moving across the country for a job because they need to stay stable for their family, or they're called to give up. We sacrifice a lot of our preferences for our spouse. We sacrifice things like money. Raising kids is expensive. So there are a lot of sacrifices in marriage. They just look different. And the point of my definitions is to highlight what is different about marriage and singleness, not to point out where the sacrifices or not sacrifices are, but absolutely marriage. I think both marriage and, a committed lifetime singleness are both calls to be very sacrificial for the gospel, and they're calls to great beauty and joy and goodness in Christ's calling on our lives. So there's both in both vocations. Neither one is better than the other, and neither one requires more or less sacrifice than the other.
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, I'm trying to discern, since that's like the word of this webinar, if we have time for conversation modeling. And I don't think we do, but would you at least walk us through the categories and encourage us as parents, caregivers, pastors, volunteers, how we could utilize this?
Absolutely. So what I did in the parent course, it's 6 weeks long. The first 2 weeks are theology. The weeks 3 and 4 are practical conversations, right? So part 1 is, what are the things you want your kids to know? You need to intentionally bring up to make sure that they are learning. They're probably not going to ask a question like, when they're 5, Mom, what is the theology of vocational singleness, right? They're not going to ask that, but they need to know that in an age appropriate way. And so these are model conversations for how do we teach our kids about those things in age appropriate ways. And then the week 4 is questions your kids may bring to you. Mom, can gay people be Christians? Mom, what is adultery? Dad, a teen friend is pregnant. What about abortion? Those kinds of questions around sexual stewardship that your cultural, that your kids are going to bring to you. So what I did, you have in your notes and in your handout, 2 different examples, and there's 3 conversations for each example because they're broken down into age groups. So the 2 conversations I gave you where one was about how do you introduce or talk about relational vocations in age appropriate ways to your kids. And the second one is, how do we differentiate between sin and brokenness with our kids, and how do we talk about those things? And so I broke them down into age groups. I think one is ages 2 to 6. And so you're just introducing the concept of what is a family, what is marriage, what is the purpose of marriage, right? And then it's ages 7 to 11. And you just add some depth and nuance into that conversation about marriage, about what marriage is, and about singleness, and how God does not owe us either of those gifts. And then the third one is ages 12 and older. And this would be, just having some really frank conversations about what are your thoughts, kid, about marriage, about singleness, about what God says about these things. And then the second one is the sin and brokenness one. And it is about how do you teach a kid ages 2 to 6 what is sin, like intentional sin, versus what is brokenness, and how we're all going to experience. We're all broken, down to our genetics, our bodies, our minds. We're all broken in all of these ways. And so how do we cope with that in healthy ways, in God honoring ways? But also, like, hey, when you discover these brokennesses, come and tell me. I'm going to help you walk through that. I want to talk with you about it. I want to, in an age appropriate, kid friendly way, we would say, I want to disciple you as you, walk toward Jesus in this, whatever this brokenness might be. And so, you could start out with something really simple. My daughter has a dental condition called what's it called? Enamel hypoplasia. And it just means her teeth are sensitive and more prone to cavities. That's a brokenness. God did not intend at creation for her to have a susceptibility to cavities, right? And so I can say, hey, your body is broken in this way. You didn't choose for your body to be broken in that way, but you need to steward your body in God honoring ways, which means you need to brush your teeth twice a day, right? And then we can connect that to sexual stewardship. Hey, you're going to find a brokenness in somewhere in your sexuality, because we all have brokennesses. And God still expects you to steward that brokenness in a God honoring way. And so there's just some age appropriate ways. And, and so those examples are in your notes, but then the parent course includes, like I said, over 35 of those types of examples, just to get your wheels turning and get you started thinking of how can I introduce these concepts, these topics of sexual stewardship, even to my toddlers. And then also just tons of like book suggestions and things like that to help you out.
Well, thank you for this. And in addition to this conversational modeling, I know that you have on the Embrace website conversation starters on a variety of topics too. So there is a wealth of resources with Amber and Equip. So thank you again for joining us. And
thank you.
We really appreciate it. Again, my name is Claire Nicholson McClunn, and I serve with Make and Deepen Disciples, and have a few announcements on some slides to conclude our webinar today. The first is to join Amber in a small group of parents and caregivers and other ministry leaders for the full course, which Amber introduced us to today, Christian Parenting and Sex Obsessed Culture. The next course is starting this month, and the website is here of how you can learn more and register. The second,
can I interject?
Oh, yes.
If you have a financial need, I do have some scholarship codes available. Just email me and say, I have a financial need. I would like to access one of those scholarship discount codes, and I would be happy to give that to you. I don't want money to be a barrier to someone being able to take the course.
Thank you. And the next slide includes Amber's email address and the QR code where you can give your email and receive all the resources that she utilizes in the Christian Parenting and Sex Obsessed Culture course. And then I already mentioned at the beginning, but for those who missed it, Embrace has developed a new suite of resources for kids and families, and you can find that on our website. And this is going to continue to be curated over time. So please go there so that you can be equipped, and some of Amber's resources are listed on there. And then finally, save the date for the next Embrace webinar with Dr. Mark Yarhouse on one of his many books that he's written on the topic of human sexuality and gender identity and faith. It will be Wednesday, December 14th, and we hope you can join us. So thank you again, and God bless. Bye.